Okay, in a previous video, I've talked about specific adaptations of xerophytes. Xerophytes, Xerophyte, are plants that are adapted to live in very dry conditions, for example, desert plants. So another type of plant that we should probably talk about is something called halophytes. And halophytes are special plants that are adapted to live in very saline conditions or very salty soil conditions. So here's one called Salicornia Europaea that is living on the tidal flats in Wadensia National Park in Germany. And you can see from this graph right here, as the salt concentration in soil actually increases, you can see that normal plants that are not adapted tend to grow less, whereas plants that are well adapted for saline conditions, otherwise known as halophytes, also are affected by their total percentage of growth, but they can actually survive a lot longer than regular plants that aren't adapted for these conditions. So we have to understand how these soil conditions get so salty. So in coastal arid habitats, as water moves up, so imagine you're sitting at a beach, the water's coming up, you know you don't run into the ocean and drink the water because it's super salty in there. But as the water comes up, it dries up, or it comes up, the tide comes up, and then it goes back down as the waves come in. I'm getting very peaceful now, thinking about waves coming up and going back down. But eventually some of that water sticks and it evaporates. And when it evaporates, that salt gets left over. It's one of the basic ways you learned in grade 7 about how to separate salt that's dissolved in water. You evaporate the water and the salt gets left over. So when that salt gets left over in the form of sodium and chloride ions, or NaCl, the soil actually becomes very salty. So you don't tend to see a lot of plants growing in those kinds of conditions, but there are some nevertheless, and they are called halophytes. Now, these halophytes have an issue. Now, you've learned before that water moves into plants by following high concentrations of salt. So as a plant is actively transporting and pumping ions into its roots, the water will follow by osmosis. This is a problem for plants in salty conditions because the osmosis gradient is in the wrong direction. So here are some strategies for helping to keep this H2O inside the plant. So first of all, if the conditions outside the actual plant are more salty, then the water is going to tend to move out of the plant and into the outside bits, right? So in order to get water to move back into the plant, you need to work even harder to make sure the inside of the plant is even more salty. And so the plant has various mechanisms and strategies for actually increasing the concentration of certain salts. And it's not just sodium chloride, it can be potassium, it can be sugars, any kind of solute that dissolves in water. If you keep them in high concentration inside the plant, then the water will still come in, because water is kind of wimpy. It just moves to wherever is salty. That's it. There are other adaptations that may be similar to those kinds of plants that live in really dry conditions called xerophytes. So for example, they may also have relatively thick waxy cuticles to prevent water evaporation. Some of the stems may be a little bit more vertical. You can see that happening here as well too. And that's an advantage, so that when the sun is directly above, you get minimal surface area actual contact by the extra heat, and it also minimizes the evaporation. This part here may seem like a bit of a contradiction, but we talked about wanting to maintain the extra salt inside the actual plant, but in some cases too much salt can actually inhibit certain mechanisms inside the plant, and so that could be bad as well too. So there needs to be some kind of balance. So if there's too much salt that's accumulated, you can also get rid of some of the excess sodium ions by actively transporting it in the other direction back to the soil instead of into the plant. So you can get rid of extra salt by actively transporting it back into the soil. You could also do something called basically excretion from glands in the leaf. Oops, I'm crossing that line out. That is not what I'm trying to do. Excretion from the glands in the leaf, so you can actually, there are specific structures and glands that will help to get rid of extra salt in there. Here's a very interesting one: accumulating the ions in a leaf and then shedding them. So it's like, I don't know, if there's too much let's say urea in my body, and I'm some kind of alien creature. I don't know how to pee, and so one way to get rid of the extra nitrogen poisons in my body is to accumulate them in my pinky, and then I chop my pinky off, and there I've just gotten rid of a whole bunch of nitrogenous poisons in my body. So that's ridiculous. But for a plant living in these kinds of conditions, in saline conditions, these halophytes, that might not be such a crazy strategy after all. So there you go. We've taken a look at halophytes. So halophytes, xerophytes. There are other types of plants called hydrophytes. Hydrophytes are adapted to living in water conditions, so they have other types of challenges that they have to overcome as well too.